We are discussing the Ukraine-Russia war, the nature of the various false flags that continue to percolate and populate the various social media and mainstream institutional narratives that exist. So if you see any more allegations of Russian atrocities, be immediately skeptical and suspect of such accusations. Apply that false flag filter. It's a useful filter in any context, historical or present or for future events that may occur. Look at it and see, are they asking me to demonize a whole group of people? Are they seeking an emotional rather than a rational response? Is the wrong party profiting? Indeed, these were the same false flag filters that would have flagged the false flags in Syria chemical weapons attacks just a few years ago. Let's talk about false flags in Ukraine and false flags in general. How do you spot or how do you flag a false flag? Well, first of all, look for an event that has you comically, cartoonishly, grotesquely caricaturing one side to a conflict. If you find yourself being asked to believe an entire group of people, an entire race, an entire ethnicity, an entire country, an entire army is the distillation of pure evil, something like the demonic imagery that we saw utilized in the propaganda for the Spanish-American War and the buildup to it, or in the buildup to World War I, or the buildup to World War II, or what the Nazis did to various races that they disfavored, including the Jewish tradition and culture, or what the Soviets often did. If we dig into that, that's when we have the first piece of evidence that we may be seeing a false flag, that they're asking us to look at some group of people as a group of people as somehow inherently and insanely evil, and that there be no rational reason for the course of conduct taking place. Second, look for something that is intended to inspire and invoke an emotional response, a purely emotional response, without any geopolitical strategy, without any wisdom or logic, without any military strategic benefit, just purely an emotional raw rage. If the event is intended to create that effect, to get us to be blind to the broader facts or contextual history or analysis or geopolitical self-interest, then be suspect and skeptical that the event is what the media or others are representing it as. The third is look at who benefits, look at who profits, look at the motive. In other words, is the party that is accused of doing this, do they have any motive to do this? Or is the party that's going to profit from this the so-called victim of this? There have been about a couple of dozen false flags already in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, but the latest one is just the most grievous. The allegations are that in a small suburb near Kiev, where the Russians occupied militarily for a very brief period of time, and by the way, they occupied it without controlling it, in the sense that they allowed the local anti-Russian mayor to stay in operational control and the local population to do whatever they wanted. They did not cut off water. They did not cut off electricity. They did not cut off any civilian infrastructure. They didn't even prevent internet or phone use. They didn't even gather phones. Kind of an odd thing to do if your goal is to commit horrible atrocities. And in fact, no atrocities were reported while the Russians were present, or even for several days after the Russians exited. The allegations are almost a week after the Russians exited, that the Russians went in and purportedly went door to door asking for all age conscriptable adults in that town, tied them up, took them down, publicly executed them, and left them on the streets. And that they did so from the very beginning, and that those bodies had been sitting there for weeks, according to the New York Times. This story fits all the attributes of a false flag. First, it asks you to see the Russian army as completely irrational, as grotesquely evil. The New York Post had some fake news headlines that actually used atrocities the Ukrainians had been committed and documented to have committed, and claimed that Russians had did it, recycling the photographs to blame somebody new, in an embarrassing evidence that Rupert Murdoch is back to his warmongering days. But so the first problem is it asks you to see the Russians as irrational, as evil, as demonic, as a group, as a society, as an army, as a civilian, as a citizen population, as we are witnessing in the discriminatory and actions targeted towards people solely based on their ancestry, solely based on their nationality. If you are a kid and you're a good pianist, you now can't perform at a concert. If you're a tennis player, you now can't perform in a tennis competition. If you're a dancer, you can't perform in a dance competition. If you simply want to rent an Airbnb anywhere in the world, you can't, based solely on your nationality. Open, blatant bigotry, illegal bigotry on display. Why? Because these kind of false flag events are designed to get you to hate a whole group of people, to get you to have your Orwellian 2 minutes of hate targeting, in this case, a race, a nationality, an ancestry, a population. So this false flag had that first evidence right out of the gate, asking you to believe kind of ridiculous things about a whole group of people. The second thing it did, of course, is it asked you for an emotional response. This is what these war propaganda is really known for. It isn't a geopolitical analysis. It isn't a historical contextual analysis. It's not a legal analysis. It's just filled with images meant to inflame your opinions in ways that deprive you of the cognizant capacity to think through the issue, to understand the issue in broader context. It is very much Orwell's 2 minutes of hate. And this had that same effect. Look at the dead body. 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 Don't look any further. Don't look any deeper. Don't look any wider. Don't look any broader. This was a classic false flag type event. And then the third screams out. Does Russia profit from killing random civilians in a small suburb of Ukraine? How? How do they strategically gain anything? To the contrary, they undermine one of their critical public relations intentions in this war, which is, as Putin has said from the get-go, that the Russians want to go out of their way to avoid civilian casualties, that they are not at war with the Ukrainian people. They are at war with the Ukrainian military and its Nazified units. In that capacity, the Russians have gone to great lengths, in fact, historically unparalleled and unprecedented lengths, to avoid civilian casualties. There's been no mass carpet bombing of the cities like we did in World War II and firebombing Dresden or napalm bombing Tokyo or dropping nuclear weapons on Japan. There's none of that. There's none, or like we did to Serbia or Somalia or Sudan or Libya or Iraq. There's no evidence of any of that taking place. You can watch the videos in live time of live streams of downtown Kiev that look just the same as they did 35 days ago when this conflict began. Secondly, there's been no cutoff of meaningful civilian infrastructure. How do you think the actor Zelensky is able to appear for the Grammys or the United Nations or for Congress or for Parliament in his repetition of his 1984 scene with the way in which that presentation was made? How? Because no communications have been cut off, civilian communications. No means of internet broadcasting has been cut off. No water has been cut off. No sewage has been cut off. No power has been cut off. Unlike what the Ukrainians, by the way, have been doing to Crimea and Mariupol and in the Donbass, where they have cut off water supply, where it's the Ukrainians that have been shelling deliberately civilian locations. It's the Ukrainians cutting off communications and civilian infrastructure. The Russians have gone out of their way not to do so. If you're not going to take advantage of the military power of your weaponry just to avoid civilian casualties, are you going to go door to door and execute 400 people of conscriptable age? Does that make any sense whatsoever? They could not profit from this. They had no motive to do this. By contrast, Ukraine has every motive to do this. Ukraine is losing this war, despite what the media says. And Ukraine is run by a bunch of grifter elites who depend on Western cash and capital for their enrichment and empowerment, and they could care less about the Ukrainian people. And as part of it, they have armed neo-Nazi aligned groups. And it's important to understand that in the Ukrainian and Russian context, Nazi means anti-Russian primarily. The same sort of horrible, psychotic, and sociopathic tendencies amongst the people that they're giving weaponry to, and then apparently the French and the British and even American special forces apparently are on the ground in Mariupol training them. You have to wonder, why is it they keep sending in helicopters to get people out of Mariupol, even though they get shot down over and over and over again? Is it because of who's there? Are some people there that aren't supposed to be there? Are we back to our old post-Cold War, post-World War II, Cold War era politics where we were arming Nazis helping Nazis, empowering Nazis, helping Nazis escape, enriching Nazis. Just research the history of Klaus Barbie in Latin America. Figure out the real history of the origin of the cocaine trade from Bolivia and who might have been complicit in that, who might have facilitated that. You don't just have to read the biography of people like DEA agent Michael Levine and others to understand the scale and scope of that Nazi collusion that we engaged in. That Operation Gladio can tell you a lot. Operation Mockingbird also can tell you a lot. Operation Paperclip can tell you a lot. So we're back in bed with bad actors, and we try to stage a false flag to do it. What appears to have actually happened is that there were various people who were defending the civilians that were basically armed and tried to fight back when the Russians came in. Some of them were buried. They're now trying to call that a mass grave, civilian graves, completely false. People are finding video documentary evidence to prove it. Secondly, that because of Ukrainian shelling, that there were people who died whose bodies were then located at where they were for the purposes of political propagandized effect. But in fact, the actual source of their death were once again Ukrainian policies and decision making. And that there's issues with the New York Times photograph. The New York Times purported to produce a satellite photo from a particular time and date. And forensic analysts have looked at it and said, well, first they noted right away it didn't quite make sense. That if these bodies were out there for weeks and were just left there, then why were the bodies in a condition as if they had just been there for a few days? Didn't seem to quite make sense. There was no dogs, no birds, no other damage, no blood around them, etc. But then people doing forensic analysis of the photos themselves using the various known weather patterns and what the light patterns would be, debunked the New York Times and identified the photo's authenticity as much more likely much later than the date that was being reported and published by the New York Times. In addition, the Ukrainian media and Ukrainian social media accounts of the Nazified units of the Ukrainian military and police structure themselves disclosed prior to the date of these photographs that they were going in to, quote, clean up this particular suburb. And what they meant by it, they said explicitly and expressly, both in these articles and in these social media posted videos, which was that they were going in to take out those they considered saboteurs, those they considered to have colluded with Russia's occupation. That's why disproportionately the people that are seen dead are wearing the white armband of Russian affiliation or appear to have Russian food rations near them at the time that they appear to have been summarily executed by the Ukrainian neo-Nazi units. Here, it's critical that a lot of confession through projection has been going on. Indeed, if you employ that filter, and confession through projection just stands for the idea that you look at an event and assume that the person is talking about themselves rather than the person they're accusing. Think about it in your own personal life. How often has somebody made allegations against you that just really made no sense at all? If you took the time to change the word you to the word I, how often was that person actually confessing their own bad deeds? Same logic can be applied consistently to Ukrainian propaganda. Ukraine just several weeks ago was claiming that the Russian intelligence operatives were in dissent and there was complete chaos and disarray in the Russian intelligence hierarchy. In fact, of course, it came out later that it was the Ukrainians who were removing key intelligence officers, the Ukrainians who summarily executed people that were negotiating on their behalf, the Ukrainians who summarily removed high-ranking generals from key positions of power. Applying that same logic, listen to the accusations of Zelensky, and he will be describing his own units, particularly the Nazified units. These were units that were chosen because of their propensity to commit morally horrific acts, because they lack the limits of ordinary conscience. These are like, if you dig deep behind Islamic fascist terrorists, the Ku Klux Klan, Antifa, certain violent communists, any of these kind of groups, you just have to scratch a little. And what you will find is their real motivation isn't the Quran. Their real motivation isn't the Communist Manifesto. Their real motive isn't the sort of clan-based racism. Their real motive often is that they are simply sociopaths. They are simply psychopaths. They are people with a propensity towards violence who want to enact that violence. And what these ideas give them is a political permission slip to act out their sick, sociopathic, psychopathic fantasy. This is, in fact, what Ukraine did, and particularly with the help and the demand of the West accelerating in 2014. That the West armed the ultra-nationalist, the far western region of Ukraine, neo-Nazi aligned groups that idolize people who colluded with the Nazis in World War II, as Stepan Bandera and the Ukrainian ultra-nationalists did. These group of people come from a part of Ukraine that is not representative of the whole country, not representative of the whole population. They have extreme beliefs rooted in an unusual history. They come from a part of Ukraine that was almost never part of Russia ever. In fact, they used to call themselves Ruthenian. You research the Ukrainian nationalist organizations in the United States aligned with these groups, they originally did not even call themselves Ukrainian, which simply means borderlands. They called themselves Ruthenian. They have long alignment with the Poles, and then when they decided they wanted to separate from the Poles, they committed extraordinary acts of terrorism against the Poles. Stepan Bandera himself was in a Polish prison for his assassination of Polish leaders. That is who this group of Ukrainian ultra-nationalists is. They tried to seize power multiple times, first in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, and then with the help of the Nazis in World War II when the Germans came in. Indeed, it was from this group and the Nazis that the Holodomor mythology took hold. This was that the Soviet famine that ravaged all of the southern Soviet Union, in particular regions of Cossacks and Kulaks, independent peasant farmers with an independent cultural history, in the case of the Cossacks, they recast that as a Ukrainian-specific ethnic, racial, bigotry-motivated genocide. That was always patently false. More people died by percentage of population in Kazakhstan than died in the borderlands of Ukraine. And where the people died in the borderlands of Ukraine, it was in the Kulak and Cossack areas, not in the far western areas of Ukrainian ultranationalism, which was not even under Soviet control at the time. This mythology that built up basically was meant to demonize the Russians and to see the Russians as their ultimate enemy. And this was part of the shift that the Nazis employed to get the ally allegiance of these Ukrainian ultranationalists who had always built their political belief structure around Mussolini's Italian fascism. And this long predated even the rise of the Nazis to power. So their fascistic tendencies are built in. They recruited from ranks of the intelligentsia, many of them the sons of the Greek Catholic priest class there in that far western part of Ukraine. Another example of how different they are than the rest of Ukraine, which is either Ukrainian or Russian Orthodox by religious tradition, not Greek Catholic. But they also employed all the sociopaths and psychopaths and lined them up. They did it back then. They ended up killing a genocide effectively against the Poles. They ended up killing over 30,000 Jews. They were just horrific in their treatment. Indeed, even the Nazis were shocked by how violent these Ukrainian ultranationalists were, so much so that they gave them their own special SS divisions. And almost wherever they went, some of the worst atrocities in the world history occurred. With the American West and the CIA decided, well, who would be useful to fight the Soviets in the Cold War? Well, Nazis, of course. And so we went into bed with Stepan Bandera. We went into bed with these neo-Nazi Ukrainian ultranationalists to try to provoke a confrontation in Ukraine. We would then accelerate that by helping to spread the mythology of the Holodomor and recast it as a Ukrainian genocide. And that would in turn lead to its true institutionalization, which takes us all the way back to the color revolution. Because this Ukrainian conflict is not a new conflict. It's the political and military end of a decades-long conflict, mostly instigated and provoked by the West. The one classic example of when you can know something is a false flag, dating back to our own first ever prominent false flag to get involved in a foreign war, the Remember the Maine, as they said, to hell with Spain, remember the Maine. What was that all about? It was about the sinking of a battleship in Havana Harbor, which our own people strongly suspected was actually the result of either an accident or internal sabotage, not the result of the Spanish. But we wanted to go to war. Our deep state apparatus at the time wanted to go to war. Indeed, if you want to know whether a false flag type event or some other provocative event in war was going to happen in that time period, all you needed to know is that it would be connected to the Navy and a Roosevelt, someone named Roosevelt, would be in charge. Indeed, it was then Theodore Roosevelt, as part of the Navy that was the one demanding that war with Spain occur, using his position in the Navy to falsify, frankly, information concerning Remember the Maine. And then, of course, it would be his cousin, old Franklin, who would do the same thing while he was at the Navy to promote World War I, and while his key people were in the Office of Naval Intelligence to withhold key information from generals at Pearl Harbor to get us into World War II. Nothing like a Roosevelt in the Navy to get us involved in war. But in this particular false flag, and one of the keys to the Remember the Maine one, was the refusal to allow an independent third-party investigation. Not only did the U.S. refuse to allow Spain to get involved at the time, but disallowed any independent third party, then slow-walked the investigation, and then had people in charge who were not even capable or competent to do their jobs. Meanwhile, key evidence would ultimately go missing over time. The same is already present in the Ukrainian latest false flag from this suburb outside of Kiev. Right away, Russia demanded a special United Nations Security Council meeting to call for an independent third-party investigation into what happened. Russia believed that Ukraine had deliberately not only created this provocative false flag as an agent provocateur type event to inspire and instigate more Western involvement in this conflict in Ukraine, but it had in fact committed deliberate atrocities, as they have repeatedly for almost 8 years or longer in the Donbass, as they had in the Crimea before Crimea decided to get out of the Ukraine. And even then, their water supply has been cut off this entire time. That they had gone in and deliberately executed people that were seen as sympathetic to Russia in that community, and then turned around and blamed the Russians for it. Well, what did the West do? Did the West rush in to hold that UN Special Security Council meeting? Did they rush in to get a third-party independent investigative team right on the ground? Well, evidence is key, because right now Ukraine is in exclusive control over this evidence, over its forensic value and quality diminishing on a daily basis. What did the West do? The West said, well, I'm sorry, it's tea time here in Britain. We got to get our tea and biscuits. Consequently, we just can't hold this meeting today, and couldn't hold it tomorrow or the next day. In fact, no special meeting about this, nor any third-party investigative team is being sent in. Instead, the only proposal is the EU. The EU will go in, like anybody would have any confidence in the EU. Not only are they ill-equipped to do war crimes investigation, but they're obviously politically prejudiced on this subject. So if you see any more allegations of Russian atrocities, be immediately skeptical and suspect of such accusations. Apply that false flag filter. It's a useful filter in any context, historical or present or for future events that may occur. Look at it and see, are they asking me to demonize a whole group of people? Are they seeking an emotional rather than a rational response? Is the wrong party profiting? Indeed, these were the same false flag filters that would have flagged the false flags in Syria chemical weapons attacks just a few years ago. In the same capacity, the bigger, broader war that's taking place is the military war there and the economic war beyond it. Let's move and shift to the military war taking place. The information propaganda war is being won by the West because the West controls the means of production. They control big tech, they control big media, and their government propaganda arms have long been successful in suckering American and Western audiences into whatever lunatic false flag even occur. There's a reason for Remember the Maine. There's a reason for the sinking of the Lusitania. There's a reason why Pearl Harbor didn't quite have to happen. There's a reason why the Gulf of Tonkin turned out the way it was. There's a reason why incubator babies getting killed in Iraq wasn't the story they claimed it to be. There's a reason weapons of mass destruction didn't exist. It's because all of those lies work. Most Americans bought those lies. You see many high-ranking political personalities and others, Sebastian Gorka, some others, just cheering on these lies, repeating these lies, championing these lies, like those deep state suckers and saps that they are, pipping themselves out, whores for war once more. That's who these people are, and they will succeed at that aspect of it. But more and more Americans are waking up on a daily basis. And in this capacity, let's talk about the other big lie that's been taking place, one of the many in this conflict, and that is the big lie concerning the military planning of the Russians. As Fred Thompson's character says in the great film Hunt for Red October, son, Russians don't take a crap without a plan. And indeed, you can assume the same. And for this, it's useful to understand deep battle policy created by Russian generals after their multiple and myriad failures at the beginning of the 20th century. They began to design and develop this strategy in the 1920s. And the main thing you need to know about it is that it believed that all future wars between armies, and that's an important point, different than wars involving insurgencies. In wars between armies, the future of warfare was a war of attrition. They believed that it was far more important to cut off supply chains and supply lines, to isolate and encircle, to create what they call cauldrons, what the Germans called kettles, to basically completely surround like you would siege an old city, but don't only to do so once you have cut off all of the means of reinforcement, all the means of communications, all the means of supply chains supplies of fuel, supplies of food, supplies of ammunition. So this was critical as part of Russian deep battle operational policy. If you understood that, and you understood Russia's intimate awareness of the difficulties of urban warfare, especially in a place like Kiev that they defended aggressively in World War II, that at various junctures before losing it and then retaking it, then you would know that what the West was telling you about Russian military strategy was also propaganda, was also a lie. There was no desire for the Russians to go in and take Kiev. They would know that, especially when they won't bomb civilian locations, won't bomb civilian infrastructure, when they are recognizing and respecting civilian shields such that they're not going after the people that are using civilian shields, then you know that the chances are going to siege a city of 4 million people who have been taught for 20 plus years to hate all Russians and see them as the cause of trying to kill them with a national genocide and a mythology that had been made up but instructed into generations of Ukrainians after the color revolution of 2004, then you know that there is no chance the Russians intended to try to take Kiev, that would be a pipe dream. Now you might faint, because one of the key aspects of Russian deep battle policy is maskirovka, a little masquerade. What is the point of such a little masquerade? It is to deceive people, to deceive your adversary into thinking you're going to do one thing militarily when you're really going to do something else. What the Russians wanted to do was to be able to encircle Mariupol and take over the Donbass, part one, and part two, be in a position to surround the core of the Ukrainian army units that are holding large parts of the Donbass region by first cutting off their supplies, second, cutting off their reinforcements, third, encircling them in a cauldron. They could only achieve that objective in their minds if they distracted the Ukrainians into holding armed forces in Kharkov, holding armed forces in Sumy, holding armed forces especially in Kiev, holding armed forces in Odessa. How do you sucker the Ukrainians to do that? Well, you have Western media propagandists to effectively you enable and enlist them against their own interest for the Russian cause. How is Russia doing militarily in Ukraine? Well, using the deep battle policy that Russia brainstormed and has been their overarching method of military operations since the 1920s, particularly in dealing with battles between armies, what we could have expected was that the Russians would first use deception. They would try to distract and divert resources, and particularly military resources of Ukraine in the initial invasion. Indeed, unlike the blitzkrieg strategies of the Germans, when the Russians would try to break through various barriers or various lines of defense, they would have a multiple front attack. Secondly, once they broke through, they wouldn't just immediately encircle. Several of the units would go much further into deep battle policy and take out supply chains, take out means of resupplying fuel, resupplying food, resupplying ammunition, resupplying soldiers. Sometimes they would use Mariupol, the little masquerade, a little deception, to also achieve that same objective. And it appears in stage one that is precisely what the Russians did. Knowing how difficult Kiev would be to take, the fact that they sent no more than 50,000 soldiers to that field, but they sent a long convoy of support materials that the world was obsessed with broadcasting, knowing that the NATO folks in the West would propagandize a false narrative of quick capture, that this would distract the Ukrainians into shackling their forces in those regions and not uniting in the east, which was the ultimate objective, to take Mariupol, to take back the Donbass. And in fact, that worked quite extraordinarily so, quite frankly. The Russians have mostly withdrawn from the Kiev regions, as predicted by some of us. They have never gone to Odessa, as predicted by some of us. They've never gone west, as predicted by some of us. Instead, they are about to take out the last remaining units in Mariupol, and are further encircling and engulfing and creating a cauldron of the key Ukrainian units in the Donbass, who now are going to be without communication support, military communication, confidential encrypted communication support, because the Russians have taken it out so consistently. Going to be without fuel. That's why the Russians have been hitting those fuel depots. Media doesn't seem to get around to explaining the why of a lot of those fuel depot hits, do they? It's because they're trying to cut off the fuel support for those Ukrainian army units in that region. Historical fact often unknown, one of the key reasons that the Germans lost in their Eastern Front battle invasion of Russia was not just the winter, not just a matter of manpower, but was because they never did conquer the Caucasus, never did get control of that oil, and they kept running out of gas on the way back, including in their mechanized units and tanks. Fuel is the key, is in fact the fuel of war. And so the Russian deep battle policy has all the elements of working. Scott Ritter predicts and projects that the Ukrainians will be wiped out by the end of April. Some honest NATO analysts have admitted the same to the Financial Times. Others think it will take a little bit longer given the number of soldiers there and their commitment that you have a lot of Nazified units that are present there. But speaking of the fuel of war, the other thing about this conflict, beyond its information war prospects, beyond its various military martial means of conflict and what is really happening in both capacities, is the economic and political war that it's really all about. Ukraine is merely a proxy for not only the West versus Russia, but for globalism versus nationalism, for two different worldviews. If you went back to 1997, you'd find that a young graduate student who had recently come back from his service as effectively a clerk in the KGB and worked as a deputy to the mayor of St. Petersburg, took some time off to study some theories of power and strategy in St. Petersburg and wrote a thesis graduate paper that suggested that real power was rooted in control of resources, control of making actual goods, providing actual services, but even better, having the necessary resources that civilized society and functioning economies depend upon, and that militaries often also co-equally depend upon. Own and control the oil, own and control the gas, own and control the coal, own and control the uranium, own and control the potash, own and control the food and the fertilizers that go to make the food. And if you did so, you could restore the wealth of any country and you could be independent of a globalist order. At the same time, the globalists were propounding a different world vision. George Soros, as really the penultimate leader of this group, was propounding that what we could have is a interdependent global economic world where military power was inconsequential because of the global economic interdependence between citizenries and countries. That would be controlled by a very small group at the top. And this small group at the top would control the financial currencies that the whole interdependent economy was contingent independent upon, and could leverage that for political control and could leverage that for cultural control. They could dictate what policies countries, nations, and civilizations followed, and they could also dictate what cultural mores and beliefs they ascribe to. This is George Soros's, quote, open society, unquote, foundation. His open society isn't open to many people beyond the George Soroses and the David Rockefellers and the Bill Gates of the world. And in this capacity, his vision was totally opposite, that resource power did not matter, that whether you made goods or services did not matter. What mattered is if you controlled the banking system, if you controlled the currencies, if you controlled the finances, if you controlled the institutions of culture and media and academia. That is why he spent almost all of his resources in those spaces and places. But that young graduate student at St. Petersburg said, no, real power is trusting and empowering ordinary people with democratic controls through a little d mechanism of using popular power as the basis of true power. Beyond that, it's resources that help the military run, that help society function, that help the economies of the world govern. And in this capacity began, and that young graduate student was one Vladimir Ivanovich Putin. And he went about building up Russia's resources. So in the 90s, when Russia became a de facto colony of the West, ravaging and raping its people and population on a daily basis, destroying and wrecking its economy for external profit and gain, with crime going up by almost tenfold, with poverty dramatically skyrocketing, with the inability, with homelessness, an unknown phenomenon suddenly appearing around the country, with oligarchs aligning with mafia units to steal and rip off from the people, both the workers and ordinary folks alike. While that was going on en masse in the Boris Yeltsin liquored up days of the 90s, of the colonized Ruski 90s, Vladimir Putin returned it to a different form beginning in 1999. And soon that the poverty rate would drop by more than half, the economy would boom, the national security would be sustained, the defense budget would increase tenfold, elections would be independently verified and validated by its most harshest critics as legitimate and authentic, and Putin would build up a popular power base in Russia that is incomparable around the world, arguably incomparable at any history in world democratic politics. And that power is what he would use to leverage the development of resources in Russia. And it's that resource power that he believed ultimately would triumph over the globalist elite. That's what this battle was all about. Who was right, George Soros or Vladimir Putin? The nationalist or the globalist? The people who believe in individual sovereignty or the people who believe in financial elite banker rule? That's what the real war is all about. Ukraine is just the battle terrain for this broader nationalist globalist conflict. There's a reason why Trump said it made sense to make Putin and Russia an ally, not an adversary, because he saw Soros in that world vision as the adversary, just as Soros saw with him. Soros saw Trump and Putin as the two great adversaries of his goals and agenda. Well, what's been happening? So the Russians said, no, you need fuel, you need food, you need fertilizer. And we got all of it. And our military is going to be just fine because we enrich the uranium and we have the food and fuel and the steel to make it all work. The West said, no, we will sink your ruble. As Biden said, the ruble will now be rubble, is the predictions and forecasts. The Russian economy would implode. The people would rise up in Russia and say, we don't want to be part of this nationalist sovereignty objective. We want to be part of the globalist elite. We want the George Soros world in our world. We want we want to make sure we have our BMWs and our Mercedes Benz and our Gucci bags and our foreign culture. Please, please bring us Disney. We must have it. This was what the Soros types actually believed would happen. Well, is that what has happened? What has happened in Russia? Has Putin's popularity cratered? Is imminent overturn and revolution and coup about to take place? Is the economy about to fall apart? Are the globalists winning? Or is Klaus Schwab crying in his Wheaties as we speak? Is instead the Russian ruble rising, the Russian economy replacing the dominant dollar?